just mentioned, we will be recording this event. So as she said, you will get a chance to see this again on the ERIT YouTube channel in a couple of days. But before we get to the end of that recording, I want to start by welcoming everybody. And I want to say good evening to some of you, good afternoon, and I think some of you in North America, it's actually still good morning, but it's nevertheless good to see all of you. Now, before I get into what we're going to be discussing today and the background to this idea, I really want to focus first on Richard's dogs.
Yeah, sorry. I'll just...
What I really want to do first is to thank two particular organizations for allowing us and helping us to hold this event today. First, I want to thank the US Embassy in Ankara, because what we're doing today, this roundtable, is part of a larger project that we're going to be conducting over the next couple of months. And so I really appreciate their support for this roundtable and the larger project. And I hope that we are able to meet their expectations with the discussion and the ideas that we pose today. The second group I really want to thank is the American Research Institute in Turkey, or ERIT. I think most of you are already familiar with it. But nevertheless, we're very lucky to have two of ERIT representatives joining us today. The first is Dr. Aliftinelle, who represents the office in Ankara, and the second is Dr. Zeynep Simavi, who runs the office here in Istanbul. And I really want to thank Zeynep and all of her staff in Istanbul, because they have managed to really organize and corral and advertise this event quite well. And so really, if it wasn't for ERIT as well as Nancy in Philadelphia, this event would not be happening today. So I really want to thank those two groups. Now, I feel I also need to provide a little bit of background about where this whole idea came from. Since 2017, I've been the director of KUDAR, which is the Koç University Maritime Archaeology Research Center. And in 2019, I started collaborating with another research center on campus called KARMA. And KARMA focuses on AR, VR technologies, and a number of the KARMA participants and faculty are actually with us today. And what we've been doing gradually is trying to build a digital development platform that allows heritage managers in the public sector to collate, curate, and manage digital models of underwater cultural heritage. And we feel there are a variety of things that can spin off from this development platform. But what's become clear in this ongoing collaboration, and what was quite shocking to me, is that not everyone sees the world the same way I do. Being an archaeologist, I naturally assume that if someone is going to interact with cultural heritage, if someone is going to display it, if they're going to record it, if they're going to take photographs or make documents about it, they're going to collaborate with the authorities, much like all archaeologists do. But it was interesting to realize that other individuals have a different perspective on this. Whereas I or other archaeologists feel that there's a need for this, some people look at the built heritage in the world around them, or even the items within a museum, and feel that these are things within the public domain. These are things that are basically free to take photographs of. And so it created this very interesting conversation. It created this very interesting dialogue, much of which is going to be reflected today. And very briefly, what we're going to be discussing is simply if a nation state can attempt to manage, control, or even stop the digital models that are going to be made of that nation's heritage. I think we're all quite familiar with the fact that the ability to make digital models of heritage, it could be a building, it could be a statue, it could be a painting. But the ability to make these models is becoming incredibly commonplace, and it's becoming much more straightforward. So it's no longer in the hands of experts, it's no longer in the hands of archaeologists. Now it's within the hands of private citizens and tourists. But if these individuals are making these models and they're then disseminating them publicly, should a nation state attempt to manage that dissemination? Should they have a role within that? Should they attempt to collaborate with it, or should they attempt to stop it? So very briefly, that's what we're going to be discussing today. And what I want to emphasize last before we get started is that this is a discussion. This is not really a debate, nor are we attempting to come up with any sort of consensus or recommendations. We're not going to be debating policy, nor are we going to be focusing on a particular country. As most of you know, our experiences are focused within Turkey, but we feel that most of the topics we're going to be discussing are relevant in many countries around the world. It could be Japan, it could be South Africa, it could be North America. We simply feel that this is a problem that will become more and more acute over the coming years. So what we're doing today is simply having a discussion, a roundtable. What are the various ways in which a country might or might not deal with this coming problem? Now, we're going to have the 4 speakers today, each talk for about 10 minutes. They're going to be presenting their perspectives on this particular issue. And then afterwards, we're going to be having discussions and questions and answers from everybody attending the event today. So if there are no other problems, I think everyone can hear me. More or less, everyone is here. I think we should get started. So we're going to be proceeding alphabetically by last name. So I don't think this is a surprise to any of the panelists. And I'd like to start today with Michael Barngrover, who works in the Karma Laboratory at the Koç University. And Michael is a developer and a researcher of virtual reality, whose work often focuses on virtual exhibition of art and cultural heritage. He is an experienced practitioner and instructor of photogrammetry and has used the technique as a hobbyist to recreate heritage sites around Turkey for his own use in personal VR projects. In addition to being a researcher at Koç University's Karma Mixed Reality Lab, he is the founder of Raptor Dance Studios, which is something I think is an amazingly great name, which provides XR consulting and project development services, a leader within the global XR crowd professional community, and he is a regular speaker at VR industry conferences on designing for social and collaborative virtual reality interactions. So I'd like to introduce Michael first. I guess the floor is yours.
Thank you very much, Matthew, and let me thank everyone involved in organizing and hosting this event. It's a lot of fun to be able to talk about this, particularly on a panel of experts who are so intimidating with the degree of their expertise in a field that I'm passionate about. That field being cultural heritage, but that I'm a lay person. You know, I am from the general population who is fascinated by history, fascinated by artifacts and evidence of that history. My earliest VR projects were always kind of attracted to the cultural history of Anatolia, because this is one of the reasons why I came to this part of the world. And my very first project was actually was a simple archery project, which is very familiar to anyone who's involved in VR. It's kind of the easiest kind of game that you can do in VR. And so I made an Ottoman archery project, an Ottoman training thing. And what was curious is that there was no discussion at any point in time as I ideated on it, as I told people about it. There was no discussion about who should be the authority to determine what I was creating or to influence what I was creating. When I went to seek out that authority, I could find no one who would respond to any of my requests. You know, it was kind of very, very abstract, the idea of putting this stuff into VR, about how you would do it, and there didn't seem to be a lot of appetite with it. That project ended up being pitched to the Okçuluk Vakfı, the Historic Archery Association, and they really liked it. And then ultimately that turned into a branded marketing experience that was even pre-Ottoman. Actually, it was set in a 13th century Anatolian Turkish village. And again, at no point in time was an archaeologist or a historian or any expert brought in to that discussion by the paying client. And I, as a person who was just really into VR and the history, could not find, even though at my university at Boğaziçi, there are such departments, I could find no one to respond or no one to work with on this. So as someone who's out in the field, who can make digital products, we're very attracted, many of us, to recreating history and heritage, but we don't really know who to talk to or have any means to talk to, no clear means to establish that relationship, to establish a collaboration. And surely those opportunities exist, but it's not easy and it's not very intuitive. And that's why I think a lot of people who are sensitive to depictions of heritage are quite uncomfortable with this field of digitizing it, because they're often not part of the project. They're not part of the ideation and the iteration and then design of it. And that's not always because their expertise is not valued or even desired. It's just very different worlds, and it's hard to bring that together at a stage in which there can be mutual investment and mutual influence on the development of that project, whether or not the project is even desired equally by both sides. More recently, in the particular area of photogrammetry, I have become somewhat of a relatively proficient hobbyist. And as Matthew mentioned, this is incredibly simple. The technology is getting even simpler. Mobile phones now can do what even just 3-4 years ago, you needed to have a digital camera. And 10 years ago, 15 years ago, you needed to have a very expensive type of scanning device. But now it's something that I'm teaching students at Coach University, particularly the archaeology department, how to use the easy tools that they have access to document sites. But of course, I developed that skill because I wanted to have these incredible, fascinating objects that I walk by every day in Istanbul. I wanted to be able to have them and show them to my friends and my family and people who are not here. So I got into this, and again, from my motivation is I want to show it. I had nothing to say because I have no expertise other than I can tell you where it currently is located. And I'm sensitive as a developer and as a creator. I'm sensitive to my lack of knowledge, the lack of value beyond visualization. Because when you're working in digital projects, particularly like virtual reality and augmented reality, visualization is that's job one. That's the most simple thing you can do. And when you're more in this industry, you realize how little you really value visualization. So you're always kind of disappointed if all you've managed to do is just to visualize it. But that being said, again, that's still a value though. That's still a logistical value to be able to show someone something that they could not otherwise see. And that's kind of where my motivation has come from. And many people like me, many people all over the world who are, when they go on tours or they're just in their cities or in their neighborhoods, documenting, creating, and sharing on platforms like Sketchfab. Sketchfab is an incredible resource, but I'm curious to see if it's seen as an incredible threat today by the other panelists, because it is in this area of different jurisdictions or challenged and questionable jurisdictions. You know where the photos were taken, but the models themselves were maybe not made in that jurisdiction. They're hosted on servers that are not in that same national jurisdiction. I don't know much about it, practically from a legal sense or from a stakeholder sense. But this is the motivation that is very commonplace among a certain digitally literate group of people, of which I am one. And it's a large group of people, and they're growing. So this panel is an opportunity maybe to, through me, kind of advocate on their behalf and just share what our motivations are, as innocent and naive as they may be, and get feedback on that and start an exchange. So happy to be part of it.
You still have a few more minutes, Michael, if you'd like to say anything else.
Oh, yeah, well.
Yeah, keep going. From your perspective, to get to one of the questions we're thinking about today, where do you feel a state, a country like Japan or France sits within this particular dialogue, within this interaction? Do you feel they should be restrictive? Do you think they can do anything?
Yeah, well, I mean, I expect we're going to get into that, and we're going to have some interesting back and forth on that.
Yeah.
I am a dual citizen. I'm an immigrant. I'm an immigrant to Turkey from the U.S., though I maintain both. I mean, I maintain the original citizenship. So that being said, I don't, feel I have a lot of authority to suggest what any one nation should do. That being said, I also feel like because I'm representing two nations, I'm not a big fan of nation building projects. So if the policies or the strategies of maintaining the heritage found within a national border is to serve a nation building concept, purpose, or uh, that's not something that as me as a hobbyist who's not sharing that nation building desire, or not, I'm not the audience for that nation building. That's not a motivation that I'm very receptive to, and I would find that very restrictive to me, because I would want to say, well, this heritage um, may or may not actually fall. It just coincidentally falls within your borders of your modern state. And so, who are you? You have a responsibility to protect it and shepherd it, and that's a responsibility that I deeply respect, because that's what allows me to be able to see it, to be able to share it with others. But if you restrict me from doing that because of a national project that is not in service of what I would recognize as a public good, I would recognize that as a governmental good or something. Then I people like myself would be motivated to find ways to go around that.
Hmm.
We would find a way. We would be motivated to try to get that out to a wider audience.
Mhm.
Not to say that we all would do it, but that motivation would be within us.
Mhm.
Some people can see that as kind of like a pirate mentality, but that is there. There's this idea that there is something of value that other people and there's a group of people who would benefit from that value who cannot access it. There's an asymmetry there,
Mhm.
and you could call it pirate, you could call it Robin Hood. It's the same thing, but just from a different perspective. And I would say that there are people who are not too different than me who would be attracted very much. Even the more that there's restrictions on it, they would be attracted to trying to digitize that and share it even more. The more that there's an effort to restrict it, the more the sense of suppressed value creates this desire to
Mhm.
release that, to share that value. So I think a national entity would have to tread carefully in terms of how they communicate it, even if that is their desire, which is to maintain a tight control for a very particular purpose that may not be serving any global audience. It may be serving a very small local audience. They'd have to be very careful about communicating it,
Mhm. Mhm. Okay.
so that it was not perceived as serving only that objective.
Yeah.
Because otherwise, it's like a fire, and you're just going to attract moths to it, and they're just really going to. It's going to be very hard um, to maintain that if it serves any touristic purpose, and that's the trick. If it's not touristic, okay, you can lock it down. That's a lot more, a lot much easier. But I think tourism actually is the bigger threat here, not even the digitizing, but the tourism value of heritage, because that's the open door where all this type of unrestricted digitization comes into play.
Mhm. Yeah, and I think that's an issue we're facing, is that, say, as you pointed out, 10 years ago, taking photographs of a historic structure or a statue was really quite simple. Over the next few years, the same people will have the ability to make three-dimensional, highly accurate digital models of the very same thing with very, very easily. The tourists can do the same thing.
Yeah, and I hope we talk about it a little bit during this panel, what that really means. You
Mhm.
have a 3D model of something. I mean, and that's a very accurate, a very theoretically rich discussion as to then what is that 3D object? Is that 3D object the object in a new form? Is it its own type of material? It certainly exists. That 3D object now exists. It communicates. It can be interacted with. It is tangible once it's made interactive. So it is something that has to be it has to be managed. But again, the management part is, why do people manage, or why do institutions manage heritage? And there's obviously many reasons, but one of them, of course, is to preserve, to protect. Then to educate is another one. But the education part opens up this issue of, well, the preserving and the protecting, that makes sense that maybe a single entity does that because there's a single physical object. But the education part, even in institutions, you find this need to open up the educational sphere to a wider group of people, a wider group of stakeholders and voices, giving access to the collections and objects of institutions so that they can tell different stories and communicate different messages and lessons through that.
Mm.
The digital space has the potential, of course, to exponentially grow that potential. And so if we find that an institution wants to make their physical collection more utilizable by a wider range of educators and storytellers, then it would seem to be contradictory to try to restrict that same access to the digital versions of those objects.
Okay. All right, that's a good point. That's a good point. Now, obviously, we're going to be discussing this more, but I'd like to move on to our next speaker. Thank you very much, Michael. I think we're going to have many more questions for you soon enough. Now, our next speaker is Yvonne Bensasson, and she is, excuse me, I need to take my glasses off. She is a practicing lawyer specializing in legal and business affairs management for intellectual properties. After completing her LLM on intellectual properties and entertainment law at USC Gould School of Law, California in 2009, Yvonne worked with the Turkish Film Council in Los Angeles, where she advised clients on legal aspects of filmmaking, such as tax incentives and project management, for projects involving the Turkish market. In 2011, she established her law firm in Istanbul, and she has been providing representation services for international clients, including licensing, distributing, compliance between different legal territories, and determining funding opportunities. Now, as co-director of the Karma Mixed Reality Lab on Koç University campus, she also takes part in R&D projects as a project specialist, and her main field of interest is the convergence between copyrights and industrial properties deriving from innovative interactive new media technologies, also known as XR, and smart contracts and blockchain-based inclusive and transport royalty and profit-sharing strategies. That's an extraordinarily broad portfolio and an extraordinarily impressive one as well.
Thank you,
Yvonne,
Matthew.
You're welcome, Yvonne. The
Great
floor is yours.
presentation. Thank you so much, and thank you very much for the invitation too. It's a pleasure to be here, and I have like many ideas floating around this subject. You know, as a lawyer, it's easy for me to comment on copyrights and intellectual properties. This is my specialty here. I'm a little bit out of my field, so I'm just going to be brainstorming with you alongside you. But the question you present here, Matthew, is like, can a country regulate, manage? Should a country try to manage and regulate the dissemination of digital models of its heritage? And as Michael said a little bit before me, is like this technology is becoming so common use, and it's just like maybe taking photographs of heritage. Today, how do we tackle this question? For example, many sites, museums, they all have their own regulations and rules, and sometimes you can take pictures, sometimes you can't, and when you can't, you're really pissed off and you don't know why, because you know you're not harming anyone. So I think it makes sense to go back behind the rationale of these regulations, laws, if they do exist, and then look at why do they exist and how are they applied? Are they applied really fairly or not? So I think the practical question, can a country regulate and manage? Both Matthew and Michael responded for digital copies. We believe that it's going to be impossible to actually have some physical constraints that make you not take those models. You know, like I would like to make reference to one of incidents that happened in 2016, and maybe you might recall it. It was called the Other Nefertiti project, and it was made by an artist called Nora Al-Badri, and she and a colleague of her went to the museum where the Nefertiti busts were held in Berlin, and she just tucked a Kinect device in her chest. She hid it with her scarf, and she took the tour of the sculpture, and she just made the model of it and then disseminated it online. The whole data is all still downloadable from her website. And you saw many institutions, museums, and printing digitally the Nefertiti head and having them. So that was an artist's statement about, you know, in this case, the statue was taken from its place of origin. It was to her a sign of colonialism, and this was her way of protesting it, basically. So I think, like, the practical question is, yes, it will be very hard for states to regulate that in the future, but hard but manageable. So let's concentrate on the ethical part of this question, like legally, why do we think that states should, could, or not regulate this area? It's easy for when we talk about personal property, copyrights, to restrict dissemination. The rationale of the law always has protecting the rights of the other. So who is the other? The other is the owner. You protect the rights of the owner who wants to maybe keep it to themselves, commercialize it themselves. So it's a little bit obvious why we have this type of protection. But when we think about cultural heritage, what is cultural heritage? What type of objects, things, places, monuments do we call cultural heritage? And of course, I'm not gonna enter into this question here with so many experts on the field, but what I want to underline is that what we call cultural heritage is something that helps us individuals build our identity. So there is a common benefit for all of us in that object, thing, monument, whatever it is, or maybe songs, dance. Now it's like, so you cannot, I mean, we all own it, basically. So who is the owner, and who is the state protecting the object from, if we are all the owners of it? So this is a little bit in my mind. I think that, of course, there are laws. I mean, we can think about the Hague Convention, that basically is the first international legal text that vests this authority to nations to preserve and protect cultural heritage. Like, we can say clearly that states do have this authority to preserve and protect, but do we harm the artifact by making a digital copy of it, or what is the rationale behind national laws that do restrict access to these properties? I think there are, I mean, I think it's changing too. It's like, it's a process. We can look at it because the law always changes, and usually slower. It adapts slower than technology or anything. But at the end, it does catch our needs. So I believe maybe back in the time, we were not even calling them cultural heritage, but it was national heritage, right? So it was a means of building national identities. And then we understood after the Second World War that it was, it's not national, it's international, it's everyone's benefit and identity at stake. So it became more widespread, and we think that we all have interest in any type of cultural heritage, whichever country it is in. And I think these digital models are helping us to reach them. At this moment now, our lab is focusing on new grant calls that are announced by the European Commission for the new Horizon calls. And the heritage calls are all mostly concentrating on digital management of rights. And I think COVID also showed us that, we do need platforms where we can actually reach these heritage sites or any type of cultural heritage, and be able to, go beyond a picture, be able to experience them as if, maybe not as if we were there, but in a different way, which might give us as much perspective and understanding and information about them. So in terms of legal view, in my mind, we have, for example, in copyrights, we always, we have the fair use. And one of the cases of fair use is personal use. So you can actually copy a book for your personal use, with the condition that, of course, you have the original one, that you bought it legally. But then for your personal studies and use, you can actually copy them. Or another one is educational use. So I think as long as we use these digital models with this rationale, I don't see legally anything that could actually negate this type of use. But I think it's also a question of using authority, maybe mentally. I think it's also a mental barrier, because many museums or site managers think that if the model gets out, no one's gonna come and visit, or less people will come and visit, or there will be less maybe revenues from the gift shop, or maybe there will be less revenues from commercial use of the copies, digital copies, So I think these are all mental barriers. But my standpoint here, Matthew, is that we need to go beyond these. And I think the European Union is also understanding this, and the Commission is, with the new grant types that they've been calling now. I think the whole sector will slowly transition to a place where these digital models will be free to use for educational use and personal use.
Okay, thank you, Yvonne. if I could, and I think you summed up your position quite well. You feel that if the models are being generated for fair use, for educational use, then attempting to manage their dissemination is really not a viable strategy, you could say, because you're, from my impression then is that you're applying the present legal frameworks regarding other copyright material towards these digital models as well. Is that correct?
Right, yes.
Okay, okay, okay. Thank you very much, Yvonne.
Sure.
Now, as I said, there's going to be more discussion and questions later on, but I want to move on to our third presenter. I've introduced her already. This is Dr. Aliftinelle of the American Research Institute in Turkey. She has been the director of the Ankara office of ERIT since 2008. Now, after studying at the University of Chicago, she completed an MA and a PhD in archaeology and in classical and Near Eastern archaeology at Bryn Mawr College, with a specific focus on first millennium BC Anatolian and Syrian archaeology. Now, Elif has participated throughout her education and career in several projects in Turkey and Greece, on land and underwater. Since 2006, she has been a member of the University of Toronto's Tainat Archaeological Project in Antakya under the directorship of Professor Timothy Harrison. She is also the assistant director of the project. Elif's research interests include the Bronze and Iron Ages in Anatolia, Syria, and Mesopotamia, with a particular focus on the late Hittite kingdoms and the Assyrian Empire, in addition to issues concerning the contemporary dynamics involving the cultural heritage of these regions. Now, most recently, she has been involved in the efforts at Tel Tainat to do a three-dimensional reconstruction project of the Iron Age monuments and the sculpture discovered at the site that are presently in fragments. Now, just to clarify, I'm just want to make sure, this is a digital reconstruction, or is this going to be a physical reconstruction of the fragmentary bits?
Well, if it's a digital reconstruction, but okay. If you can have a digital reconstruction, you can always get a 3D print of it, right? So this is the new technology. But anyway, I will talk about that a little bit in a second. If I can upload my PowerPoint.
There it is.
Okay. Okay, well, thank you very much, Matthew. And everyone else in this session. This is a really huge topic. I mean, the more I thought about it, the bigger it became for me. From strictly an archaeological perspective, we are perhaps, I mean, I don't want to call it a paradigm shift, but in a way, at the doorstep of some sort of a shift in our perceptions of how to deal with archaeological data and how we understand historical sites or archaeological sites and material culture. And of course, I come from a very traditional archaeological educational background. So we all believe in nuts and bolts, and maybe to respond to something Michael has said, before I think archaeologists jump into reconstructions, we are extremely careful because there's so much we don't know about remains. So there's a lot of educated guesses, I guess, in a lot of reconstructions, but nothing is cut in stone. Any sort of a reconstruction can be changed with more information. So that's why we're a little traditional in jumping into this kind of reconstruction stuff. However, the digital technology has opened up a huge world to us. First of all, there is more and more archaeological information. There's more and more data that is being recorded, which we cannot hold in our heads any longer in a single mind. So we do need digital tools, recording tools, to keep our material sort of manageable. This also opens up opportunities of comparisons and working with other projects and other finds. also, what's happening right now is a lot of long periods of human experience that's being studied, especially from the perspective of climate and ecology studies. Now they're working more and more closely with archaeologists to sort of tie their wider sort of observations and results with more specific archaeological data. So collaborations are starting to be inevitable in different fields. So there are new methodologies, analytical tools, and results, as you both mentioned, Yvonne and Michael, that we can share with the audiences. So there are some shifts that are happening in our minds as well. So what I want to do is focus on 3 examples to emphasize the more collaborative and educational aspects of 3D recording, perhaps to generate some ideas of how we can move forward with this recording opportunity that comes with new technologies that is open to more people than just specialists. So this was something I've been thinking about, just going a little beyond who owns this material, then what can we do with the inevitable, in a sense. So of course, the first thing, whoops, how do I go forward? I'm sorry. Here. Of course, I have to talk about Tainatuk mentioned by Matthew in his introduction, where we have been making incredible discoveries of sculptures, among other things. And many of you are probably familiar with the famous Shupiluliyuma, the giant king, Iron Age king from Kunulua, which is the ancient name of Tainat, Tel Tainat, in Antakya, Hatay region in southeast Turkey. Now, in 2017, we found a female, maybe his consort, maybe his ancestor, we don't know. She was really badly damaged, deliberately destroyed, and thrown over some of the pieces, or hundreds of pieces of fragments that were just scattered around the sculpture. But this is one of the many sculptural pieces we know. We have been collecting pretty much every single stone piece, basalt piece from the site, and keeping a record of it, thousands and thousands of pieces. We believe that they belong to at least 5 pieces of monument sculptures, inscriptions. We don't know. So what we started in 2018 and 19 seasons is a digital scanning of these pieces. And as you can see, some of the larger pieces we were able to pull together and combine with the actual sculptural piece. And some of these pieces come from the museum's earlier excavations. Some of them actually come from the site itself. So this is giving us an incredible tool. What we want to do is actually scan all the pieces digitally. And then in Toronto University, the computer science program do a collaborative study, which I think it's already started, to come up with some sort of a program to be able to put some of these pieces together. We're also going to start looking at different types of with XRF scanning to see whether we can distinguish between different geological sources. But anyway, what I want to emphasize here is this is a huge step in being able to reconstruct things that are badly destroyed in antiquity or even recently. And also this is opening up doors for collaboration, and we're hoping that this will lead us to come up with some educational tools at the site. Another project that is important that I want to point out, even though it is for specialists and it's a very specialized project, is the Cuneiform Digital Library Initiative, which is brilliant. It's actually basically scanning cuneiform tablets from all over. There are some 500,000 tablets that are being scanned from 4th millennium BC onwards. And over 30 museums and institutions are making their resources available. There's also some sort of a Wikipedia like source that is associated with it, sort of like an encyclopedia, where people are putting in information, translations, data related to these tablets, and the tablets are open to public. Scholars, specialists can study them, restudy them, discuss their interpretations of certain readings, and pretty much anybody can provide information to this Wikipedia entry, except that it has to go through an editorial board because it's such a specialized topic. But this is also extremely important because as you can see, with 3D scanning, minute details can be seen and read, and it's shared with the communities. The cuneiform signs, sometimes the eye cannot pick up certain details, but you can really look at, really make them huge, magnify them, the pieces, look at them, and work with them. Although this is a very specialized area of archaeology and history, it is becoming more and more available for the public. And people are moving more towards interactive and sort of collaborative projects. And this is an extremely important educational tool. So another project I want to talk about, first of all, it's related to underwater, and we're part of an organization by Kudar. And also I wanted to focus on this for two reasons. First of all, this was one of my only underwater projects. So as a field archaeologist on land, this was very interesting for me to see how we think about underwater coming from a terrain background. And secondly, under the directorship of Güzdem Varunluoğlu, I think she's also participating in this event. Maybe she will have a few things to say. This was actually a project of database design and digital recording for her dissertation on databases and virtual museums. But also this was initiated by a public need from the area of Kaş in Lycia in southern Turkey, where diving has become an extremely important source of tourism. So there are growing numbers of tourists. I don't know what's happening since the beginning of COVID, but until then, hundreds and thousands of people were going to Kaş for diving. And this created an increased access to underwater sites that have not been recorded before. people knew about them because divers generally know what's where, but these were not systematically studied and recorded. So what happened on this project was over 200 divers were trained, and some of them coming from archaeological backgrounds like me, but some of them just divers, some of them just recreational divers. But some basic training was presented to each diver to be able to record or recognize a site and record it. May it be a single amphora underwater or a cluster of amphorae or an actual harbor site or a shipwreck. In the process of this, the database was generated, and the idea was to put this as an open access digital resource online, so divers can provide information to this database as they do their diving. And in the end, new sites would be discovered, and also already discovered sites would be revisited, and that created some sort of a management of the entire region. So the public would be keeping an eye out on these sites. And the most important part of the training was not to touch any material culture underwater, keep everything in situ, preserve it, do basic digital photography and drawing, and maybe getting some coordinates. It was very basic. And you can see some of the photography here. I wish I had colored photos, and some of the drawings that a little more advanced drawings that the project did. But some of the drawings were just like stick figures, whatever, just to provide basic information. And this got a lot of people involved in this project. However, the website was never opened as the Ministry of Culture and Tourism never granted permission for this. I presume it came from an anxiety towards providing these sites for looters. However, those of us who are in the field know that looters know fields a lot better than archaeologists do, because archaeologists need to get permission to study in a certain area. It's extremely controlled and it's extremely detailed. However, looters don't have any permission or don't have any restrictions. They have all the permission, let's say, to go and do whatever they want. So, so this project, I think, was, it can be considered groundbreaking because it brought specialists together, the public together with specialists, as well as the Ministry of Culture. We always had a temsilci, a representative with us, managing the project. And I really think this should be revisited for the future as some sort of a model, because there will be people with their 3D cameras, as mentioned before, going around doing their recording. That is inevitable. There's nothing we can do about it. And maybe what we need to think about is ways of collaborating with the public and getting specialists involved with the officials to figure out ways of managing this. So just to finish, I wanted to emphasize a couple of pluses and minuses. With the 3D recording and making copies, maybe, you make a lot of the sites more accessible, and you start managing them. And that creates, if you look at it from a more positive perspective, opportunities to protect it. Because if there is any sort of a looting or any sort of a vandalism activity, if people keep going back to the same sites and record, continue to record them, that will provide evidence of what's going on, when looting might have happened, and maybe it'll create some sort of a framework within which these can be prevented. And of course, it's a great educational tool, training tool, and creates opportunities for cooperation between different groups. But at the same time, there are problems with it. Storage of the data is always a problem. It always comes up with digital management issues. And there is an issue of management of the public. Are they using them for the good? Are there things that we cannot think of that can be used for, that can be negative? Is it really helping protect, or is it really like what the Ministry of Culture is afraid of, increased looting? And then there is also the issue of correct training and education. Who should provide the training and education, and how should that be managed? And of course, related to that is the management of cooperation. So maybe what I'm thinking about now is perhaps to start talking with the officials to see how cooperation can be managed and encouraged. And maybe certain types of cooperations can be discouraged. But this could be done as consortiums, as groups, and maybe this will affect how the individuals manage what they're making copies of with their 3D cameras. And finally, I want to finish with 4 questions, 2 of which are related to what we've been talking about. As Yvonne mentioned, is 3D recording creating some sort of a harm? Is it going to create some sort of a harm? Is it going to harm any sort of knowledge that needs to be gathered from an object or a site or a space or an area? Can the specialists and officials work with the public in recording, managing, and preserving sites and heritage as digital tools become more commonly used? This is something that I am very much interested in seeing to move forward in this new period of dynamics. And 2 unrelated questions that popped to my mind is from the perspective of tourism. Michael mentioned that a little bit. When people have access to digital models, and Yvonne also mentioned this, or even make their own models, will they stop visiting the sites? Is this a source of anxiety? Should this be a source of anxiety for us? And also there is the problem of restoring or reconstructing heritage sites or archaeological sites. I would like to see if we can come up with models that are generated from 3D recording that can be an alternative to actual building. Can this help the human experience in the physically restored structure or space? Because when you rebuild something, when you reconstruct something, you also affect the human experience. You take the archaeological site or building outside of the ruin state and you present something pristine. And if this is something that is a driving force in restorations, can we deal with the 3D models and kind of leave the archaeological remains to themselves for studying and understanding the actual material culture and deal with the 3D models? So these are some questions I've had, and that's it. Thank you.
All right, thank you very much, Alif. I appreciate that. And I particularly appreciate the 4 questions at the end. Those are very nice because they bring up issues that not only are issues that I was not thinking of, but they also really emphasize, I think, a couple of the other, you could say, themes that I believe are all hovering around. So thank you very much. I want to move on to our last presenter. This is Dr. Richard Lee Bart. He, as I said, is going to be discussing his experience, particularly working at the site of Gordian. Now, Richard received a BA in English from the University of North Carolina at Chapel Hill in 1971 and a PhD in classics in 1988 from the same institution. He was a lecturer on archaeology and ancient art at Chapel Hill from 1990 to 2008. Following that, he taught similar courses for the art history department and for the classics department at Elon University until 2016. He spent 3 years between 1980 and 1983 at the American School of Classical Studies at Athens and worked on excavations in the Athenian Agora and the ancient Corinth. In 1990, he changed his focus to Turkey, where he began an architectural study of the tomb chamber of Tumulus MM at Gordian, the capital of the Phrygians and the historical King Midas. This project has evolved to include ongoing structural and environmental monitoring and conservation for the tomb, which dates to approximately 740 BC. Now, at 2,750 years old, this tomb is one of the oldest standing wooden buildings in the world. In addition to establishing various details of the ancient methods and sequences of construction, Dr. Lee Bart's work is, Dr. Lee Bart has had a recent discovery in 2007 of the presence of Phrygian names inscribed on a roof beam of the tomb chamber itself. And these are names that I particularly hope I have the chance to see if we can visit this summer. Dr. Lee Bart, the floor is yours.
Thank you, Matthew. Nice to be able to talk about something I've worked on for a long time. Rather than have a general discussion of 3D imaging and the issues thereof, I want to use Timulus MM as a case study. So what I'm going to do is have a slideshow, basically, and walk you through. I know most of you, if not all of you, have been to Gordian, been to see the tomb, and probably been a little disappointed, unless I was there to show you around. But this will take a few seconds to get organized, and then I think you might not see me for a while, but I'm hoping you can see this. So this is Timulus MM. For those of you who don't know, it's the largest by far of the officially 125 tumuli in the area of Gordian, southwest of Ankara. It still stands after 2,500 years of erosion, 53 meters tall. It was excavated by Rodney Young of the Penn Museum in Philadelphia in 1957. And you can see the scar, and this is a closer view. This is the modern approach. You buy your ticket at the museum across the road, and then you're able to come walk down this 67-meter trench, which was cut for the excavation and aligned at a much later date to make it safer for visitors. You get to an outer gate, then an inner doorway with vents on either side. That leads you to a chamber with some displays put up by the Ankara Museum. And then you walk down a 67-meter tunnel. As you get to the end of that, you see an iron grill in front of you, suspended between 2 concrete pillars. And then you see the ancient wood of the tomb chamber itself just beyond. There is not a lot of room there. This is when Halil Demirdelin, now of the Ethnographic Museum in Ankara, was our temsilci, and he had started an education program at the Ankara Archaeology Museum. And we suggested that he do a program for children of Yasihuyuk, the village. He put out an announcement the afternoon before from the village mosque. The next morning, 42 children showed up. And so they're now crammed in. I'm inside the fence. There's a gate to the left. There's about a meter of space on either side of where the farthest child away from you is standing. So you can't get very many people in there. What a tourist can see, and when I say tourist, I don't mean that in any disparaging way. That means anybody who has to buy a ticket and go look at the tomb that way. Archaeologists and others working at Gordian on the permit, I always take the new members, do a full tour inside the gate with the permission every time of the Timsalji, and with informing the guards across the street, so no one gets surprised by anything going on. So you're looking now in a very wide angle view. The tourist area is just to the right. On the left, you're looking down the north side of the tomb chamber, and to the right, the west side. Everything that you see here that is air now was originally filled with rubble, which you see just a little bit down in the lower left-hand corner that I've restored. The whole thing is surrounded by a stone wall. The construction of it, you'll see a little bit about how that works a bit later, but there's a stone wall that, around the perimeter of it. What you're looking at are juniper logs. They form the outer casing, and then this is what you can see from the tourist gate. You can look from one side straight through the hole cut in 1957 by Rodney Young to gain access to the tomb chamber to do the actual excavation. The interior, the walls and the ceiling are made of pine, which is locally available, as is the juniper. The floor is made of cedar, which is not locally available, but that's sort of another story. In 1957, that interior looked like this. The skeleton, what remained of the king, most likely King Midas's, the famous King Midas's father's skeleton. He lay on the remains of a cedar coffin. There were inlaid serving stands leaning against the east wall in the far corner. There were 3 large cauldrons. There were 100 small bowls and 15 large bowls, 10 bronze pitchers, remains of a banquet. This was taken, as you see in the lower right corner, by a Life magazine photographer who came over specifically to see this excavation, see this monument before they had cleaned it out. If you go there today, you see through the other way now, looking out, you can see where the tourists can come to. They can get within about a meter of the outer casing. A bridge I designed and had built back in 1993 to avoid the area where the coffin was, because that area the floor is much deteriorated, as is the area along the west wall behind me there, because there was a lot of organic material, leather, in the case of the west wall, and the body and the coffin and the fabrics at the north wall. You can see some of the distortion, and I can show you more of that. The reason I'm showing you this now, and another photograph on the other half of the tomb chamber a few years ago using a total station, we had some grad students who were studying where the little white dots are. Those are slips of paper stuck in gaps, cracks in the tomb, marking where there were iron spikes originally in the tomb wall, on which anything that had a handle or a means of hanging were suspended from these iron spikes. They had all rusted through, everything had fallen to the ground, but the iron left these shadows, which are harder to see now than they were originally because of linseed oil that was put on the walls to help preserve it, or so they thought. One of the reasons I'm showing you this is because almost no tourists have ever seen the interior, the full interior of the tomb chamber. There is, of course, nothing in there now from antiquity, except some remains of probably a long strap of leather with some bronze bosses. But if the tourist area is up on the left, where you see the far lights, we've come down. We're now on the south side, which has a little more room than the other 3 sides. This is a composite photograph. This is what I used to have to do. This is 6 or 7 photographs that have been stitched together to give you just an idea of what the outer casing looks like. One of the problems in the tomb is you can't get far enough away from it to take overall photographs. You can only get actually a sense of the scale of it if you're up on the top, either on the roof or beside the roof, looking over the whole top of the double pitched roof. Get a sense of the quite large size of it. This is much larger than any other tomb chamber excavated at Gordian. Charles Williams came in 1961 from Philadelphia and did the first drawings of the architecture of the tomb chamber, the measured drawings. He was limited by the fact that all the rubble had not been cleared out. He had very poor lighting. He risked his life, almost lost it because he was using a generator out at the entrance to make electricity for the lights he was using. What he didn't know is that the air was circulating in and bringing carbon monoxide. So that made him very ill for a few days, and he was not so interested in going back after that. I decided that I would work on a CAD model with a Turkish colleague, Banu Bedel, now working for the Ministry of Culture. And this is a rough longitudinal section straight from the digital model that we made. This allowed me to make various models and manipulate the layers. So this gives you a better sense of how the tomb was constructed. Today, looking north from that south side again, this is a restored section of what the tomb chamber looks like today. The model that I built was what the tomb chamber looked like when it was first built. So I had to straighten out all the walls, straighten out the roof, straighten out the roof beam, which is now, everything is now sagging in. It shows the modern supports. The orange ones were installed in the late 50s up into 1961. The black ones around the outer casing were installed by me and a team from Ankara in 2002. The gray that you see is the solid gray is concrete, the concrete shell that is supporting again the area above, which was originally filled with the same rubble that you see down in the bottom and in between the juniper logs at the outer casing and the interior walls. They backfill that. What you're seeing on the outside is the original tumulus fill. The difference in the two colors of soil on the outside of the stone wall shows the original ground level and the browner soil, and then the tumulus fill above that. It is a very simple construction, but very complicated to explain properly. Here is a plan also made from the CAD model. You see the tunnel coming in, you see the area the tourists get to go into. The door is there on the right of that fence. Shows the position of the various supports and gives you the various materials that are used. Now, when I started in 1990, I did all my recording using plumb bobs, measured, I created a grid on the floor. I did all of these weird contraptions to try to measure this. 6 or 7 years ago, a grad student, Sam Holtzman, was working there. He now has his degree. He was helping me in the tomb one day. I was late in the day. I was cleaning up. He wandered off with his phone, and I heard him taking some photographs, and he came back in a few seconds, literally less than 5 minutes. He had taken a series of photographs sort of randomly along the north side, had an app, pushed a button, and it made what you're seeing is a still shot from a 3D PDF, which I was astounded. I'm not a complete Luddite, but this was more than I was ever expecting. I had known that what we need at Gordian for MM is some way for people who can't go inside. The tomb is way too delicate to let everybody in and walk around. So we have to have some means of recording it and letting the public go inside. In 2019, Keats Webb, working with the Smithsonian Institution at the time, did a study, which we hope to continue, of 3D imaging using photography. Matthew Harpster, leading this roundtable, is planning, we are hoping we can get this thing done, a laser scanning of the tomb chamber And we are hoping that that is going to provide some basis for a virtual, what I'm hoping is for a virtual tour possibility. I have offered to the former director of the museum and some of the archaeologists at the museum in Ankara, I can recreate a one-to-one model of the tomb chamber over at the museum if they would like that. People could come up and see either in the current state or preferably in the original state. Part of the problem with recording this tomb is the distortion created as the weight of the tumulus above was pushing down on the wood, and the wood was creeping, splitting. As you see, this is the central crossbeam that's pushed down through one of the wall timbers. Here's a shot that I took on the other side of that central crossbeam. You can see the angle. If I didn't have the plumb line in there, you would get disoriented as to what's going on. The crossbeam was originally horizontal. You can see the angle that's been propped up a little bit. The wood on the right has bowed out. The upper beam has been pushed down into this beam and crushed the wood out. So recording it is remarkably difficult. Matthew mentioned the inscription. The inscription is right there where the light is. There's another name right where the scale is. And if it looks like it's awkward working right there, this is a photograph of me that a photographer who was visiting the day that I first found the inscription, I heard him taking photographs, and I went down and asked him, who he was, what the deal was. And he sent me these photographs. And so I'm wedged in up against the logs with a nice pad between that and the ladder and me. And the inscriptions are up there. 4 of the photographs that I've just shown you, including this one, were taken by tourists. And I pulled them off of the internet, except for this one, which I was given by the photographer. Extremely hard to deal with this tomb, but I am hoping that we can get it all squared away that somebody can appreciate it better than you can the way it is. So I'm hoping to make a better experience eventually for any visitor who comes to Gordian. All with the permission from the proper authorities. Anytime I have to do anything physical, I get permission from the Monuments Commission in Ankara. I go through the director of the, whatever director there is at the time of the Ankara Museum. And I try to be as proper as I can with everything that we do. It is a very special monument. I have to correct Matthew. It is not one of the oldest standing wooden buildings. It is the oldest standing wooden building in the world. There is nothing else on earth like this. So it needs to be appreciated better from the visitors.
Okay. Sorry for my mistake. That was my fault. Thank you, Richard.
A minor detail.
A minor but important one. And I think if I understand your perspective correctly, I think it's similar to what Alif mentioned, that you see the generation of these digital models as there's a benefit for education. There's a benefit for protection in the creation of this material. Is that correct?
Oh, absolutely. I mean, I was a teacher for all those years, teaching ancient art and archaeology. Yeah. I've given hundreds of tomb tours over my 30 years or so at Gordian. And only a few, a select few, that's visiting archaeologists or dignitaries, whoever, who get permission, I can take them inside that metal door. Fewer still get to go in the tomb chamber. There was a time when I would take everybody, all the team from the Gordian, and would be in there all around, way too many people. And we had a sort of an incident one day. And I've never taken more than like 4 people in the tomb chamber since. And that happens more and more rare.
Okay, I understand. Well, as you said, I hope we're able to conduct any of this work this summer. There, unfortunately,
you and I will be talking about this later.
Okay, no problem. We'll certainly do that.
I have a plan.
We'll certainly do that. Now, as I mentioned at the beginning of this event, there is going to be time for discussions and questions and answers, both between the five of us and also among all of you. So if you have any questions, if you have any ideas, please feel free to mention them in the chat or to please raise your hand. But I'd like to get a chance to start things off, because I think what each of the speakers have mentioned, and which is, I agree, a very important thing, is that the ability to create these digital models is valuable for education, it's valuable for tourism, it's valuable for the preservation and protection of the heritage as well. But I think we also know that just like, how can I say, anything else that's in the digital realm, once there's a copy of it out there, the copy will proliferate. There'll be 1, there'll be 3, there'll be 7, there'll be 10. That can be almost an inevitable thing. And so I think this also brings us to an interesting question, and it's something that Alif mentioned in her closing remarks, that there is an obvious educational benefit to having these digital models. But yet, at what point does the proliferation of the models potentially become harmful? At what point does the dissemination of this information begin to apparently make the authorities that are in charge of this heritage nervous? And why do they get nervous? What is it that could make them concerned about this? And again, keep in mind, we're not specifically talking about Turkey. This is an issue I think is going to be relevant in many countries around the world. And so this is something I'd like to open up to the 4 panelists right now. Like, at what point does this become a concern and it moves beyond this issue of education? What do the 4 of you think?
Well, I definitely have some thoughts on this subject. If I can just go first because I do a lot of events in VR. I mean, I organize and I host and I work events that take place in virtual reality, which is both headset and non-headset. And so those are environments that are 3D environments. Oftentimes they're completely novel, completely original, but sometimes they are meant to either they're inspired by a physical real world site, or sometimes they're even a photogrammetric recreation, depending on what it is. And those sites, those virtual sites in many of these platforms are available for anyone to come later and host your own event in there. It is a 3D space that is free. It can be, you could have 100 different events happening in the same virtual environment at the same time, because there's no physical limitation on it. It's just about how easy the platform gives access to do that. But again, because they're 3-dimensional, they exist outside of the platform that's hosting the networking functionality. You know, that's a 3D environment that could be seen in Blender, could be seen in a custom app that someone just has on their home device, or their own institution, like a museum. You go and because it's a 3D space, it can be utilized by anyone who has it to do whatever they want to do with it. And that is a major threat to people who have sensitivities towards the use of that space. I can say that I've been involved recently in ideating on some projects to photogrammetrically document synagogues in Turkey, because they're under threat in some neighborhoods that the neighborhood is not very well protected of those types of sites, and so they want to digitally preserve them and then be able to take them around the world to be able to tell the stories of the people who used to live and had their lives affected by those sites. But as I had to tell the people I was working with on this, if you put it in one of unless you are really strict and really, really controlling on access to that, the moment that that's out there, it can go into a platform, and I'll mention some names I don't expect most people will know, but there's platforms like VR Chat, Altspace, Engage, Mozilla Hubs. These are all 3D VR platforms or 3D virtual platforms where people can meet and go to places. In these platforms, you have groups of people who you do not want in a synagogue or any religious site. You don't want them in a culturally sensitive site. You do not want them to have that access. But once that site exists as a 3D asset that can be taken into any of these sites, that ability is there. There are these communities who now have access to a digital site And when if you feel you should exercise editorial control or some type of usage control, that's out of the cat's out of the bag at that point. You don't have that anymore. And I think that's the biggest threat that some people are aware of and some people are not aware of, but they should be when they go to that. Once you create these 3D recreations and they are available for people to use however they want around the world, or whatever way they want to use that. And that is conceptually very threatening, I think.
Okay. What about the rest of you? Yvonne, Alif, Richard, what are your thoughts?
Yeah, I think Michael, it's a good point, actually. I agree that it's more of an editorial control that you want to have over the digital model when, as you say, Matthew, once it's out, you can't control that anymore. And I think something else, maybe editorial control and commercial use, I think, is another reason why those who do have control over the site might not want it to be out there, because then it can be used easily in a film, in a video game, in whatever you can think of, basically digitally. It can be printed, it can be sold in various places. I mean, we all know this example of printed on a t-shirt. This question was already there with photography. But I don't know if, as long as you do not harm the site, so as long as the digital copy was made without harming the site, then it being out there and you losing editorial control, is that like a legitimate fear? Which institution does have editorial control over it? Like, why is it not open to adaptation and to people to play and use it however they want? Is another question. I think Professor Richard's example was very relevant, because as he says, the tomb is very hard to capture. There is very little space, room, and it brought to my mind that usually the capturing is very strictly regulated, because we always fear that while you do try to capture, you might harm the site. So I think that's a legitimate fear on the side of the authority. This is why they probably should be regulating how we do capture those models. But if there is no risk to the site at all, and if it's done properly, I'm not sure if there is any legitimate editorial control on any body or authority.
Can I say something? It's well, this is a big source of anxiety, I think, that's shared by the officials in Turkey. And Virginia Herman here has a comment, and maybe Virginia, would you like to make yourself apparent and say a few words about your experience? She's the field director of Zincirli excavations. Is she there? Oh.
She says she can't mention anything right now.
Okay, well, well, she's basically saying that she wasn't allowed to make a grammatical model. Her request was denied because of the concern for creating fakes. Yeah, I mean, there is a huge anxiety among the officials in all of these things I think you're mentioning here, like misuse of all this material, creating unreal material culture, using objects with new identities assigned to them, maybe more politically charged identities. So yeah, but I mean, once you start putting an editorial system there, then everything becomes more and more controlled. So I don't know what's right. I mean, with the cuneiform tablets, I mean, you have to be a specialist of some sort, even if you don't have the background that everyone else has. If you put in some information in their Wikipedia site with the Cuneiform Digital Initiative, they are able to look at what you're saying and see whether it's correct or wrong or whatever. I mean, they have a system which can be applied, but it's very I mean, it's a small space, right? I mean, it's ancient texts. It's very small. It's a small world. With the whole entire world of cultural heritage, whether it's material culture that's small in museums or vast sites, that's a huge, huge problem.
Yeah, and I think it comes back to one thing that Michael mentioned in terms of who, you know, in effect, effectively what we're talking about is the narrative of the country. What are the items? What is the tangible and intangible things within the country that represent it on an international stage? And so it gives the country, and North America does this, France does this, you know, India does this. It gives the country the ability to create that narrative, to perpetuate it, and to maintain it. And so when we're talking about the threat, when we're talking about this potential harm, I think the fear is that these 3D digital models can remove those items from that editorial control that a state may have over the creation of that narrative. It allows alternative narratives and alternative interpretations of that country to be generated. And I think when we're talking about harm, I think that's one of the ways this harm might arise. So it's not necessarily a physical destruction of the thing itself, but it's still the sense of losing that control.
Yeah, I agree with that, Matthew. I was going to follow that up because Elif had said something quite similar. There's a competition here. In certain fields, perhaps there's just not so much demand from a very wide and uneducated audience, or you know, but there are obviously certain aspects of heritage. There are certain areas and artifacts that have a wide appeal, and they resonate strongly with large groups of people who are maybe open to alternative histories. You know, if you look on YouTube, how many channels are perpetuating sometimes wholly novel explanations for very so I apologize, for very familiar objects, for very important objects of national or cultural significance, and YouTube videos are able to very easily be made to repurpose those for alternative uses. And the question with regard to creating digital versions of these objects, is that somehow worse? Is that more effective than a YouTube video would be? Is that more effective than what, you know, the pictures that have been around for a long time, photographs of these things have been? And I want to say that in some sense, yes, I believe that the potential for models to be more effective in communicating to an audience something, vessels of communication, is because they can be interactive. 3D models, because the user can turn around, has some dynamicism in how they interact with that. I think that there is a latent potential that 3D models of artifacts can be more effective vessels for communicating message and educational lessons than what we call passive or non-interactive mediums like video or photographs. And so that's maybe there legitimately is an increased risk that competition from these alternative storytellers could be more effective if they had access to the 3D models.
Okay.
I think anything that is digital and gets on the internet can be abused. I think we have seen that in every facet of the internet at this point. That I should hope that would not deter people from doing things that are actually potentially useful. I know there is the argument that if people see everything online, they won't go to museums to see all the objects. Of course, I'm going to go to see the original objects every chance I get. I also love to see the backside of objects, which you rarely can see in a museum. They're up against the wall. There's some, I like to see the bottom of it. I like to see the inside of it. In a 3D model, you can actually do that. You can spin it around and see the whole thing. As far as fake antiquities go, 3D models would have, I think, no effect on that. You can make a replica. You can make a giant replica, a small replica. Yvonne talked about the Nefertiti bust. That is, yes, it's still available. There's some question of whether the scanning the artist did was real or whether they actually got the 3.5 trillion point scan that the museum had officially done but didn't tell anybody, and somehow that got leaked out. But that's another story. The fake antiquities market is 100 years old, maybe more. Oscar Muscarella, formerly of the Met Museum in New York, used to tell the story. This is one of his specialties, of course, is fake antiquities. And there was, I think it was in Iran, they found some antiquities in the market. They were trying to track down where the fake antiquities, where they came from. And they finally found this guy in the village who was making these. And the people, the archaeologists and the officials said, you know, these are great. They're so good. Why don't you sell them as replicas? He said, oh, thank you. But if you think my fakes are good, you should see my father's fakes that are in the British Museum. So this is something that's been going on for a long time. You can get great replicas on the Citadel of Ankara at Sharif Akshit's shop. He makes wonderful things, and very few that would be construed as antiquities. Although his father had made some marble semi-iconic figurines once, and I was going to get one, and I realized I probably couldn't get this through customs. I would get arrested because it was so simple and so nicely done, and there were nothing about it by eye. You could tell that it was not an antiquity, except it was very fresh. So I don't think 3D modeling is a problem for fakes. If you're worried about selling replicas, yes, maybe, but museums have shops. They sell replicas. You can get the tie-a-knot head in 2 sizes. So
Okay.
I think overall, the potential for educating the public, educating students, educating interested people, or disinterested people, and making them more interested outweighs any of the other stuff. Now, I know that museums and countries are very concerned about these issues. They're very protective of their rights and the material. But as you said, the models are going to be made. They're going to be on the internet. People take photographs. I just showed you 4 photographs that tourists took of MM, and they're very useful. When I was teaching, I would take images from wherever I could find them. And now there are exponentially more images on the internet than there were when I was teaching. And that's only been a few years. So on whole, I think it's a positive direction that we're going. But I know there are going to be risks and there are going to be abuses of it.
Yeah, I think they're there as well. Now, obviously, I have more questions, but a number of good ones have arisen up in the chat as well, if you haven't seen them. So there's 3 or 4 there I want to bring up. And the first is from Gozday. Gozday, do you want me to read this, or do you want to take charge and ask yourself? Okay, I'll read it. Michael, I think this is going to be mostly for you if you haven't read it. She's asking if it's possible to add a digital certificate or for the model itself to become an NFT, a non-fungible token, like a unique art piece. And could that, in a way, certify it as an original, and then perhaps the model itself is traded by the creator? Do you think that could work?
Yeah, and I think Yvonne also answered. I mean, so yes, I mean that is the purpose of an NFT now. But I think the important thing that is sometimes overlooked with regard to NFTs is that it is a certificate. You can know that that digital entity, that is the approved one.
Mm.
It does not stop it from being copied. It's just that those copies will be clearly marked as, you know, that's not the approved one. So it's great if you need to sell it, because you know that's where its value comes in, that certificate of authenticity, which for institutions, yes, and that, of course they want to know that they have the legal authority, or not legal authority, legal right to have that model and to do these things with it. And so in that sense, to help maybe to enforce regulation on that may be passed about these 3D models, NFTs have that value, because then you can go and say, hey, show me your model file. That's not the one, you don't have the right to use that. So it can be used in that sense. But if we're kind of talking about like people copying that model, loading it up on a server on a platform in some other part of the world, or doing something else with it, it's the burden then is on enforcement, which is kind of already where I think, I mean, Yvonne knows much more about this field, but I feel like that's kind of already where the burden is now. It's on like tracking down instances where someone did something that they didn't have a appropriate license for what they were doing with it. So in short answer, I mean, I think yes, and Yvonne, I think we'll give something more authoritative to that. NFTs can be used in this context, but it may not really be addressing the main concern behind it.
Yeah, Michael. And thanks. You know more than me about the capabilities and the detail about NFT and how it works. So it was nice that you answered first. As you said, once a copy is used for commercial means, for example, in this case, in this scenario, the authority could have asked that user to prove that they are using the original copy. But I want to also mention something else here, which is in terms of copyrights, the creator of the digital model becomes also a right owner here. So there are rights over the artifact, and then whoever, if the modeler, let's call it, has the right to make the 3D model, then they also have rights over this model. They created it. It's an adaptation work now, and they hold rights over the model. So there comes another layer of right ownership, and they might also have some interest in controlling the dissemination of their own models.
So what you're suggesting, and I will get back to the other questions in the chat, what you're suggesting, Yvonne, is that even if, for example, my home state in the United States said that the digital model I made is infringing on their legal rights of heritage that represents the state, the simple fact that I created the model gives me a certain amount of power over its dissemination. Is that correct?
Yes. So, I mean, you could sue someone who is using your digital copy model without your permission, and that person could actually claim that you didn't have the right either. So, I mean, if you're doing something illegal, I think a court wouldn't, decide for you. But yeah, technically you do have that claim.
Interesting. I didn't realize that. Well, there are more questions I want to bring up that are in the chat. And next one is from Kathleen Slane. Now she's asking, or she has the impression that there is less of this private creation of digital models being done in the US. And here she suggests that most sites already have videos recreating the various aspects of the site. And so what she's curious about is if the presence of these videos creates less of an incentive by the visitor to create their own models of the site as well. Do you think that's the case? Do you think it's appropriate? Or do you think people will still take photographs, still make their own models or what have you of the site, even if unofficial video is available?
Yeah,
There was,
I guess, sorry, Richard, go ahead.
I was just going to give you an example. One of the problems with this, as I said about it's sort of a simple construction that's very difficult to explain. And I have given people who are going to make a video a tomb tour, explained with images how the tomb was built, given them my plans and sections, copies. This one group made a video that was shown, it was a semi-interactive video that was shown in a booth in the Ankara Museum and also later at the Gordian Museum. And they completely screwed up the way it was built. Okay, I can deal with that. But on the last part of the sequence where they're sort of rotating around the tomb and one of the walls is gone, they're showing the objects inside. They had digitally modeled a ring-handled bowl. And all of them, the coffin was there, and some objects were there. And this one bowl, they had screwed up the scale of it by a factor of 20 or 30. So that the ring handle was sticking through the wall of the outer casing, and it would look like a giant jacuzzi inside the tomb. And I was like, if they just, so one thing is, if you know what if you know the object, like I know get somebody who's doing the technical stuff and get me, if I'm the expert on this, to tell you, how it should be done, even if it maybe not as graphically exciting as you would like it to be. But if you can get it done properly, it's way better than doing it completely improperly, because it's misleading, it is not really useful, and they get out there. It is in part a self-correcting problem for a lot of digital technology, is the software changes, and older models, older images, older programs, you can't run anymore on new equipment. And so the original thing is just worthless. So keeping it as simple and generic as a basis for the software would be key for the long run.
About whether or not, like in the US, there's less of this type of material generated and accessible. It's really hard to say, and that's actually a fascinating question. My gut is that Europe leads this, and I don't know that I could attribute it to any greater access in the US to video documentation of these things, as much as it is perhaps there's just a greater amount of or just more of these objects readily available, geographically close, for people who want to, for the hobbyists, the people who want to do this. I'm referencing what seems to be the selection on Sketchfab. Again, that's kind of like, I would say the main place you'd go to see hobbyist photogrammetry of cultural heritage right now. There are definitely like the specialist sites and the academic sites, but that's the main public space, which is not public, it's commercial. And I think it likely has to do with access to this stuff is so much easier, I think, in Europe geographically, because the concentration of museums that have artifacts that people want to see, or people are curious to see, or who have some type of significance to the hobbyist is probably greater. Just the density is greater in Europe than it is in the US. In the US, the sites I've seen often are things like warships, not as much Native American, sites, and I don't, it would be curious because maybe there's fewer hobbyists who have a personal connection to that work, that they want to capture it and put it into digital mediums, or that those artifacts are less accessible to them than they are, or also Europe, this is a gut based off of the type of conversations I have about cultural heritage VR projects. In Europe, there is oftentimes support for those because there's no commercial benefit for them. It's purely a project supported by local municipalities and government entities who want to support that, and that includes photogrammetric documentation. And many times it's accessible. It's part of the project to make that more accessible on platforms like that. And in the U.S., at least, the general sense is that there's less financial support for those types of projects. And maybe all these things come together to explain why we see a lot more European heritage represented in these kind of public repositories.
Mhm. Well, I actually have I'm sorry, did I interrupt? Okay, I'm sorry. I actually have another question, and I think this gets back to the other issues relating to sort of control and editorial management of the material itself, as well as the sense of copyright over the heritage and its reproducibility. And something that I've been curious about, and I think I may have mentioned this to one or two of you already, is that I think we all agree that this will become an ongoing problem. There will be this continued issue of individuals, either as private citizens or otherwise, making these three-dimensional digital models and then simply disseminating them as they like. And so what I'm curious about is if this phenomenon might be similar to the way that music companies in like the 80s, 90s, and the early 2000s had to deal with all the pirated music that they found coming out of their factories. Individuals were simply making copies of compact discs and then distributing them widely over the internet as well. And I wonder if that could be a good model for perhaps nation states to look at and consider, like what was successful, like what companies dealt with this problem well, what companies did not deal with it well.
It's an interesting example, and I think how that resulted was music streaming, was getting out ahead of this and saying, hey, for a very small price, much cheaper than you would have spent before to buy it. Don't worry about the fear of legal consequences, so that streaming became successful because there was a legitimate fear in certain jurisdictions that there's real legal consequence. And you see lots of other parts of the world where that streaming thing probably hasn't taken off as much because that fear really isn't so present. But in certain markets, that fear coupled with this proactive solution to bypass it all was very successful. And I'm not certain how that would work for a nation, a national entity to do. It almost feels like it would have to be a multinational. Yeah. There has to be an agreement as to how we're going to share this or create some standardized platform by which everyone knows I want to see this 14th century castle. I want to see it really well. Well, there's only one place I'm going to go. That's the place I'm going to go. It's the Spotify for cultural heritage, and that's a multinational effort, and so it's monumental. And I guess in music, it still took them about 20 years and a lot of them didn't survive. A lot of those companies didn't survive that. And to be honest, many of the companies, almost all of them didn't survive. Actually, Spotify is a new company, and is really disrupting it a lot. So nations don't have that same type of, they're not going to fall down because their culture, like their revenue from cultural heritage and tourism wasn't enough. But governments change about it. It is complex. I'm not sure that's a great example, but it's a fascinating thought exercise. I'm curious to hear what other people think of how that might look.
In my opinion, yeah, it did take a lot of time, as Michael said, 20 years for the music industry to end. Did it really? So as he says, it's because the technology and streaming became available and a viable alternative way of distributing music. and there was incentive for people to use it. It wasn't as expensive, it was really cheap. There was a lot of pedagogical work behind copyrights and why it should be respected and the rights of authors, etc. So it did take a while. If we were to compare it with our question, I think maybe the platform to regulate that could have been the UN. UNESCO could work on a draft of something that, you know, can allow a platform where all nations maybe could upload their digital models and education institutions could use them for free, and any other commercial use can be based on a certain type of remuneration, licensing, etc., which in turn can be used for the management and preservation of the site, like royalty sharing. I mean, that I think would be great. And it's not impossible technologically. I think we're already there. It can be done.
Okay. Elif, did you have something to add? You're muted.
Sorry about that. I want to respond to what Zeynep Akturez mentioned, the London Charter. I actually, I have to admit, it's embarrassing. I hadn't read all of it, but I knew that it was related to computer-based sort of regeneration or visualization. Maybe someone else can answer this question. I mean, as far as I understand, it's requiring a certain academic sort of accuracy in creating the 3D reconstructions or visual reconstructions of heritage. The question is, number one, is Turkey a part of it? Just because I'm from Turkey. I know other countries are. I don't know that whether Turkey has been following it. And the second question I have is actually, if not, can we get people to sort of create guidelines as a form of managing these reconstructions, maybe within the framework of the London Charter, or create something similar to that?
May I say a few words on this, if possible?
Yes, certainly. Go ahead.
Yeah, okay. Why I ask this is, of course, I'm an architect and I use in heritage conservation area. And while you were talking, I mean, during the session, I remembered this big fuss about, maybe you remember it, digital model of the lower city of Troy, which popped up in mid-1990s. The issue of accuracy was raised there, which is showing actually that a code of conduct is also required in the discipline itself. Richard was saying a person who is capable of doing the accurate representations is required in the practice, but in general, the digital models are being promoted like non-destructive ways of reconstructing places, things, etc. Physically, yes, maybe, but ideologically, I find them equally destructive as the physical models, because, I mean, although you know that what you're seeing is a model, thanks to these improvements in technology with all these eyeglasses, the equipment you can use for augmented reality type of reconstructions, at one point, maybe, although you know that you're experiencing a model, it's not easy physically to distinguish between what is the model, what is the reality that you see outside, and there's an imprint of that visual image and you keep it, although you know that it's a model after all, it's a reconstruction, it's the idea of someone which is mentioned to you that already it is not the real thing, it's just an assumption, it's a hypothesis, etc. You keep that image, and image is very strong, and I find that very destructive as well, because this is a way of promoting things, as was done by propaganda films in the past century. And also we can do a propaganda of our academic ideas, and we can make them look real and convincing in these models. And this aspect of authenticity, actually, transparency, accuracy, etc., I think is as dangerous and important as the copying and marketing, etc., because this is something maybe we can control, because this is our field. The other is the legal phase of it, the market phase of it is a little bit beyond our control. But within the discipline, how we can guarantee this code of conduct, and how I mean, there, even if, you know, these kind of charters are showing the way, but there is no way of obliging states, even if Turkey was a partner to this particular charter, even with the Venice Charter, even with the, I mean, World Heritage Convention, there is no, how you call it, yaptırım, I don't know it in Turkey, in English. There is no mandate in the sense of a legal procedure. And even if it exists, I mean, how would you prevent people from practicing this in the field of academic? This is a question to all of you. I think this is one of the problems I see with these improving technologies. I'm fascinated by them on the one hand, because it is also helping me to understand how perception occurs, how we judge between reality and what is not real, what is real after all, etc. On one hand, that there is this very deep and nice part of it, and on the other hand, there is these worries on my part. Thank you.
I mean, if I can just clarify a point about photogrammetry that I think is important, is that photogrammetry is not reconstructive, because it really can only build what is in the photo. So it kind of, it gets wrapped up in reconstruction, but reconstruction is normally using traditional modeling methods, which the photogrammetry would be a reference point in the same way that photos and other diagrams would be to try to keep the dimensions and stuff. But so for the things that, you know, tourists walking around with their cameras and recreating models is a little bit less a concern in that sense, because it has to be physically present and represented in the photos to find its way into that model. So that particular methodology still has some risk, of course, but it's interesting that it doesn't have that particular risk of promoting a narrative, unless of course that narrative is already represented in the physical structure, you know, as it is today. But your concern, Zeynep, I feel like, and this is not my field, so I'm just getting this out of the way because I have a thought on it, but it sounds like these concerns are probably present in all types of communication, you know, whether they're diagrams, hand-drawn or anything like this. You know, I remember when I was a kid and looking at the, you know, my history books, you know, and just loving the pictures, and then getting, you know, older and realizing, well, those pictures are a little bit fantastical. They're, you know, they're artists' imaginations in often cases for trying to communicate to me, the reader, what this corpus of knowledge over time, which is not a consensus, was presented to them for that. So I just want to say that, but I leave it to the more informed on the panel.
Well, there's something I'd like to bring up, but I don't want to interrupt the other three of you if you want to mention something right now. No? Okay. I mean, I think for me, the interesting issue that Zeynep brought up regarding not necessarily authenticity, but the notion that there may be a point where we start to take the represented model as, you know, an authentic copy perhaps of what the reality is. I think a related problem to that, and this I've seen this brought up in other literature, is that perhaps until recently, there's been a distinct socioeconomic division between the people that can make these models and the heritage that they are actually recording. So in very many ways, until this technology was very widely available, the ability for some people to make these models was out of their reach, but yet people in, for example, London, the creators of the London Charter, people in Western Europe, people in North America, they were still able to go to other countries and make these highly accurate models. And then those models would be disseminated, even if they were done so under the authorities and with the permission of the appropriate governments. But then it means that it's not that particular government that is creating, you could say, the narrative itself. It's not that government that's creating the image of what the past was like. It's now individuals from Europe or North America that are doing so because they're creating the past. And as a result, I wonder if that impacts our memories of what we think the past of that particular country was like.
I think Zeynep's question was relevant, but as Michael said, maybe we should have mentioned in the beginning, I think all of our explanations were taking in, we were actually thinking of photogrammetric models, which are reflecting the artifact as it is, like is as if you take a picture without any reconstruction or restitution work being involved. So in that sense, I think, Matthew, the narrative comes, I mean, I think you simply by making the digital copy, I'm not sure how much you manipulate the narrative actually, right? So you can use the digital model to build on top of it and give a narrative, but I think necessarily just the digital model itself is not doing that, and so there's no difference with using a picture or a video and constructing your own narrative around that, right? What do you think?
What I mean is actually in each model, I think we are selective of what we show. A model is not showing all the aspects of even a photograph. I mean, how you frame a photograph is telling what you're photographing there, what you're selecting. I mean, you can show a place full of people. If you focus on a handful of people, it would look very crowded, as it is done in the press. It's a model of reality as well. In that sense, I don't think that a photogrammetric representation, it's still a representation, it's not the reality. So it cannot be more objective than a photograph. A photograph is not objective. It depends on how you present, how you would like to present reality after all. And then of course, there is the possibility of playing on it. You can present further with further plays as editing on the image. You may you may make it look like yeah, it's forgery. It's beyond maybe question, but that is not what I mean. What I meant was this selectivity.
Mm-hmm. Okay, I think we have another question. Lena, did you have your hand up?
Yes, I did. Sorry, can you
There
hear
you
me
are.
okay? Yeah, okay, awesome. So I agree with what Zeynep is saying. I don't think that this idea that we're searching for this one truth is a fallacy, you know? These monuments or images, whatever we're creating, whether it's a photo or a 3D model, they depend on our perception, and our perception from modernity doesn't necessarily overlap with how people perceive those things in the past. So that's one thing. The other part is, The emphasis on the nation state, I think, is important, but the nation state is underlied by a group of people who live within that community. So I'll speak from my own nation's perspective. I'm a resident and citizen of Canada. That's currently where I live. We have traditionally marginalized our Indigenous peoples who live here. If we are to look at this nation state, our identity that's being created and crafted via these different monuments that the federal government wants us to believe, we miss out on all of those traditionally marginalized individuals. And so I think there's a certain amount of, like, as you said, danger in terms of using these monuments for nefarious purposes, but they can also be a way for grassroots movements in terms of individuals who aren't able to speak to be able to have their piece and have their voice heard within these important narratives about what a nation's identity is. So I don't know that we should be having a nation state control all of this and be the gatekeeper, but it should be also those individuals who inhabit those lands, whoever they may be. Thank you for this wonderful event, by the way, for organizing it.
Okay, thank you, Lana. That's a good point. Are there any comments on that?
I think, yeah, it follows up on some of the things we said earlier on. There's a beauty inherent in digitizing because it becomes something that can be copied and shared. That's an essential component of it. That's historically, that's why you digitized it, is to make it copyable, to make it shareable. More recently, I think because digitizing various types of objects has gotten so easy that we see a wider range of things that have a real monetary value or even some type of like intrinsic or conceptual value that people really elevate. It's made digital, it's made the process of digitizing, it's pulled it into, well, this should be fitting into a commercialized economy or to a governed processes. Because now this is something widespread. This is something, it's part of the economy. And I think that's natural. That happens when something gets so widespread, but its essential value in the beginning was that you could copy and share it. And then people could do with that what they want. They could make value. They would have the opportunity to make value from that. And attempts to try to limit that or to challenge that essential value of digitizing is, at worst, it's misguided. But at best, it's well, maybe it's best. At best, it's misguided, and at worst, it's something more nefarious. Maybe I flip those, but I don't think it's likely to succeed. Because one, that's what digitizing does inherently. And if you try to outlaw it or stigmatize, access to these digital heritages, then you're missing the opportunity to give voice to those who historically have not had the opportunity to speak with that object, with the benefit of these digital objects. This is an enhancement to their ability to speak. And it would be a shame if, as it becomes more well understood, its value is seen more as something to bring into traditional power structures that are antithetical to the value of digitizing, which is sharing.
Okay, well, I think that could be the idea of simply sharing and its importance. That could be a good point upon which we could start to close things up. Because to be perfectly honest, we've gone along much longer than I thought we would. We've been here for over 2 hours discussing this, debating this, trying to find new insights and new ideas, looking at different ways of dealing with this issue. Can a nation state manage this heritage? Should it work? Should it not work? And I think what I've certainly learned is that this is, well, I knew it was already complex when I arrived, but I think what I've certainly learned is that there's so many other issues of authenticity, representation, giving individuals in muted communities a voice to express themselves that are issues that I simply never considered. And so to finish, I think I simply want to thank a large number of people, in addition to the US Embassy, as well as ERIT. I want to thank all of the visitors, all of the individuals that participated today, as well as everyone on the panel, all 4 speakers. Michael, Yvonne, Alif, and Richard, I really appreciate your time. I really appreciate your help and your thoughts and your ideas. And I hope that we can continue this conversation in the future, but we're all going to do it in person. So unless there's anything else that anyone wants to bring up, I think this is a good time for some of us to go find dinner. There's nothing else? Okay.
Thank you for organizing. It was a pleasure.
Well, it was a pleasure having you. I really appreciate it. Thank you very much again, and I hope to see you all soon.
Thank you. Thank you.